While he was gravely ill, Godfrey of Lorraine made a will in which, staying true to his Easter promise, he left the city of Jerusalem to the Patriarch. After his death, no authoritative figure remained in Jerusalem except Warner of Gray. The Patriarch and the leading knights were away, engaged in the campaign against Acre. Although Warner himself was near death, he understood what needed to be done. Rising from his sickbed, he immediately secured the Tower of David and staffed it with Godfrey's personal guards. He then consulted with Godfrey's household officers, Matthew the Seneschal, Godfrey the Chamberlain, along with Robert, Bishop of Ramla, and the former Patriarch Arnulf. After their discussions, the Bishop of Ramla and 2 knights were sent urgently to Edessa to inform Baldwin of his brother's death and to invite him to claim his inheritance, as the people would only accept a relative of Godfrey as their leader. This move had already been carefully prepared. The message to Baldwin was also signed by knights currently with the army, including Geldemar Carpinal and Witcher the Alemán. This group, mainly Lorrainers and Northern French, had either come to the Crusade with Godfrey or had aligned themselves with him, and they were deeply opposed to the Normans and Italians, whose influence had grown over Godfrey. Their intentions remained secret, and they chose to keep it that way. The army was not informed of the Duke's death. While Venetian ships lingered near Jaffa, waiting for the north wind to calm, a messenger from Jerusalem reached them with the news of Godfrey's death. Their commander, uncertain about how this would impact the campaign, quickly sent his 3 fastest galleys north along the coast to catch up with Tancred and the Patriarch and ask what they planned to do next. The army was stunned by the news, as Godfrey had been widely admired. Daimbert appeared uncertain, worried about his own claim to power. Still, he trusted in Godfrey's will and assumed the Lorrainers were without a strong leader. When Tancred, keen not to squander the chance of Venetian support, suggested delaying the assault on Acre, but at least capturing Haifa, Daimbert agreed. However, he also sent an envoy to Jerusalem to claim the Tower of David in his own name. The army advanced toward Haifa and set up camp on the slopes of Mount Carmel. Not long after, the Venetian fleet arrived in the bay. Haifa at that time was mainly populated by Jews and had a small Egyptian garrison. The Jewish inhabitants, remembering the fate of their communities in Jerusalem and Galilee, were determined to defend the city at all costs. The Muslims supplied them with weapons, and they fought with great determination. During a battle in the harbor, the Venetians lost one of their ships and, discouraged, withdrew into the bay. Meanwhile, Tancred was enraged when he suddenly discovered that Godfrey had already promised Haifa to Geldemar Carpinal. In protest, he pulled his troops back and withdrew to his tent in anger. Daimbert had to use all his diplomatic skill to persuade Tancred to rejoin the fight. He warned that the Venetians were already preparing to depart and assured Tancred that Haifa would be given to the most deserving man. Tancred eventually agreed to resume the attack. A renewed assault was launched, and, after intense fighting, the main defensive tower was captured, allowing the Crusaders to break into the city. Those Muslims and Jews who could escape fled to Acre or Caesarea, but the majority were killed in the aftermath. Haifa was taken around July 25th. Soon afterward, the army leaders met to decide who would take control of the city. Although Geldemar had a claim, Tancred had more troops and Daimbert's backing. Geldemar was forced out and left the city, joined by the Lorrainers within the army. Together, they moved south and established themselves in Hebron, a city previously ruled by Gerard of Avanes, who may have still been with Tancred at Haifa. Following this, Daimbert and Tancred began discussing the larger issue, the future of Jerusalem's government. By then, Daimbert had received word from the city. His envoy reported that Warner of Gray still held the Tower of David and had refused to surrender it to the Patriarch's representatives. Baldwin had already been summoned to come south. Warner died on July 23rd, exhausted by his final efforts. Though Daimbert's supporters interpreted his death as divine punishment for resisting the church, it made no practical difference. The Lorrainers still firmly controlled the tower. Daimbert knew he couldn't assert his authority alone. He needed Tancred's support, especially since Tancred's territory now stretched from the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee to the Mediterranean, effectively cutting Jerusalem off from the north. Tancred, for his part, despised Baldwin ever since their falling out in Cilicia 3 years earlier. With Tancred's strong approval, Daimbert decided to offer control of Palestine to Bohemond. He immediately dispatched his secretary, Morellus, to Antioch with a letter to the prince. Daimbert had no intention of letting Bohemond misunderstand the nature of the power he was being invited to assume. In his letter, he began by reminding Bohemond that it was thanks to his support that he had been elected patriarch. He referred to the Patriarchate as the mother of all churches and the ruler of nations, a claim that completely ignored Rome's authority. He went on to describe the concessions he had secured from Godfrey and complained that members of the Duke's household had tried to block those agreements. Daimbert restated the terms of the Easter endowment, which declared that Jerusalem was to pass into his hands upon Godfrey's death. But instead, Warner of Grey had unlawfully taken control of the Tower of David and had offered Jerusalem's inheritance to Baldwin. As a result, Daimbert called on Bohemond to come to his aid, drawing a dramatic comparison to how Bohemond's father had once supported Pope Gregory VII during the struggle with the German emperors, though the historical parallel may not have been as favorable to the church as Daimbert believed. He instructed Bohemond to write to Baldwin, ordering him not to enter Palestine without the Patriarch's permission. If Baldwin refused, Bohemond was expected to use force to stop him. In other words, Daimbert was asking the Christian prince of Antioch to declare war on the Christian count of Edessa. Also, the Patriarch could take control of Palestine against the wishes of the very knights responsible for defending it. What Bohemond would have replied to this letter is unknown. It seems unlikely he would have risked a confrontation with Baldwin, and even if he had traveled to Palestine, he probably wouldn't have stayed under Daimbert's authority for long. But the letter never reached him. Daimbert's fortune had turned. Meanwhile, the political landscape in northern Syria had shifted. Raymond of Toulouse had spent the winter in Latakia, governing it jointly with the representatives of the Byzantine emperor. He maintained excellent relations with the governor of Cyprus, from whom he received supplies. In the spring, he received a letter from Emperor Alexius, thanking him for his support and requesting that Latakia be handed back to Byzantine control. The letter also included an invitation to visit the imperial court. It's likely that the letter was brought by the eunuch Eustathius, recently promoted to admiral of the imperial fleet. Eustathius arrived with a strong naval force and immediately began reclaiming ports along the coast of western Cilicia, including Seleucia and Caracas. He then expanded his reach deeper into Bohemond's territory, capturing Tarsus, Adana, and Mamistra. Raymond accepted the emperor's invitation and set sail for Constantinople at the beginning of June. On the way, he encountered the Venetian fleet near Cyprus, which was en route to Jaffa. Raymond reached the imperial capital around the end of the month. His wife, Elvira of Aragon, who had accompanied him throughout his journeys, remained behind in Latakia under the protection of Byzantine authorities, along with the remnants of the armies from Toulouse and Provence. Daimbert's secretary, Morellus, arrived in Latakia at the end of July on his way to Antioch. However, the local authorities detained him to inspect his documents and discovered the letter addressed to Bohemond. When it was sent to Raymond's men for translation, they were so alarmed by its contents that they decided to suppress it and placed Morellus under arrest. Had Bohemond received that letter, his future might have turned out much more favorably. Unaware of the unfolding events in Palestine, he set out from Antioch at the beginning of August, heading up the Euphrates in response to a plea for help from the Armenians in Melitene. Earlier that summer, he had managed to strengthen his southeastern border beyond the Orontes River by repelling an attack from Ridwan of Aleppo. Ridwan, in turn, had to ask the emir of Homs for assistance. But the alliance between Homs and Aleppo was unstable and posed little immediate threat to Bohemond. Though the Muslims did succeed in retaking Tel Manis, which had been left poorly defended after Raymond Pilate departed with the Count of Toulouse, Bohemond remained confident enough to push his control further north. Despite his inability to stop the Byzantines from reclaiming Cilicia due to his lack of naval strength, Bohemond was focused on securing the passes through the anti-Taurus mountains. These routes would likely be used by any Byzantine force attempting to strike Antioch directly. So, when Gabriel of Melitene, fearing an attack by Malik Gazi-Gumustikin, the Danishmend Emir of Sebastia, called for help, Bohemond was eager to respond. For 3 consecutive summers, the Danishmend Emir had been raiding Gabriel's lands, and now it seemed likely that he would attempt to take Melitene itself. Having seen what happened to his son-in-law Thuras of Edessa, Gabriel was reluctant to seek help from Baldwin, even though he was geographically closer. Bohemond, however, had always treated the Armenians with respect. Among his allies were Cyprian, the Armenian bishop of Antioch, and Gregory, bishop of Marash. Acting through their mediation, Gabriel offered to surrender his city to Bohemond, if only he could be protected from the Turkish threat. Before leaving Antioch to respond to the appeal from Melitene, Bohemond took a decisive step that would mark a permanent break with the Greeks and ultimately lead to the first irreversible schism between the Greek and Latin churches. John IV, a Greek who had been reinstated as Patriarch of Antioch by Daimbert, had remained in office up to that point. But Bohemond suspected him of supporting the Byzantine Empire and encouraging the Orthodox Christians within his patriarchate to hope for imperial intervention. Bohemond decided to act. He expelled John from Antioch and appointed a Latin cleric in his place, Bernard of Valence, formerly a chaplain of Daimbert and recently made Bishop of Arda. Bohemond had taken Bernard to Jerusalem to be consecrated. Later Latin historians, such as William of Tyre, tried to legitimize the Latin Patriarchate by claiming John had already resigned. In reality, John only resigned after arriving in Constantinople, where he made way for a Greek successor. He then retired to a monastery at Oxia, where he wrote a bitter treatise condemning Latin practices and oppression. His claim to the Patriarchate was taken up by a new Greek patriarch, elected by the clergy who had been exiled with him. From this point forward, there were 2 rival lines of patriarchs, Greek and Latin, each refusing to acknowledge the other. Thanks to Bohemond, the schism between the churches became permanent in Antioch. The Byzantine emperor now added to his goal of reclaiming the city the mission of restoring the Greek patriarch to his rightful place. With the threat of betrayal within Antioch removed, Bohemond departed for Melitene. Concerned about leaving the city poorly defended, he brought only a small force, his cousin Richard of Salerno, 300 knights, and some infantry. He was accompanied by the Armenian bishops of Antioch and Marash, and some of his knights may have been Armenian as well. Confident in his ability to defeat the Turks with even a small army, Bohemond marched carelessly into the mountains, separating Melitene from the Aksu Valley. But the Danishmend Emir, Malik Gazi-Gumustikin, was waiting in ambush. He launched a surprise attack. The Franks were caught off guard and quickly surrounded. After a brief but fierce battle, their force was completely destroyed. The Armenian bishops were killed, and Bohemond, once feared across the Muslim world, was captured and carried off into a humiliating captivity. It was Baldwin who ultimately saved northern Syria for Christendom. When Bohemond realized he had been captured, he cut off a lock of his yellow hair and gave it to a soldier who managed to slip through the surrounding Turkish forces and make his way to Edessa. Showing the hair as proof of his identity, the messenger delivered Bohemond's urgent plea. He begged to be rescued before the Turks could carry him deep into Anatolia. But Baldwin was more focused on the stability and safety of the Crusader states than on rescuing his old friend and sometime rival. He quickly set out with a small force of only 140 knights. Despite the size of his army, his scouting was excellent, and word of his advance spread rapidly, exaggerating his numbers and striking fear into the enemy. The day after his victory, Malik Gazi-Gumustikin had marched to the walls of Melitene to display the severed heads of the Frankish and Armenian soldiers he had slain. But when he heard that Baldwin was approaching, he chose to retreat with his spoils and captives back into his own territory. Baldwin pursued him into the mountains, but was cautious not to venture too far in an unfamiliar land where an ambush was likely. He also didn't trust the local population. After 3 days, he returned to Melitene. Meanwhile, Bohemond and Richard of Salerno were dragged off in chains to begin a long imprisonment in the remote mountain fortress of Nixar, ancient Neocaesarea, deep in the Pontic region. Gabriel of Melitene, relieved and grateful, welcomed Baldwin as his savior and immediately pledged himself as Baldwin's vassal. In return, Baldwin left him 50 knights to defend the city. Their presence proved critical a few months later when the Turks launched another attack, only to be repelled thanks to the garrison, by then aware that Baldwin had left the region. Baldwin didn't learn of his brother Godfrey's death until he returned to Edessa around the end of August. He spent September organizing his journey south and making arrangements for the governance of Edessa. His cousin, Baldwin of Labourg, was in Antioch at the time, apparently serving as Bohemond's deputy and perhaps maintaining communication between the two leaders. Baldwin of Labourg was summoned to Edessa, where he was formally invested with the county, though under Baldwin's overlordship. On October 2nd, Baldwin set out for Jerusalem, accompanied by his household, 200 knights, and 700 infantry. According to his chaplain, Fulcher, he mourned his brother's death, though he rejoiced even more at the inheritance that awaited him. Daimbert's hopes that Bohemond might stop Baldwin were in vain. Bohemond was lost in captivity, and the Franks of Antioch were more than happy to welcome the man whose intervention had saved them from the consequences of their recent disaster. Baldwin stayed in Antioch for 3 days. Concerned that he might encounter trouble on his journey, he sent his wife and her attendants by sea to Jaffa. At Latakia, where he was warmly received by the local authorities and spent 2 nights, many soldiers came to join his cause. But their enthusiasm faded quickly when word spread that the Turks of Damascus were planning to destroy him during his march down the coast. By the time he reached Jabala, his force had shrunk to just 160 knights and 500 infantry. Pushing forward with forced marches, Baldwin reached Tripoli safely. The new emir of Tripoli, Fakhr al-Mulk, was in bitter conflict with Dukak of Damascus, who was trying to seize parts of the Lebanese coast. Eager to undermine his rival, the emir gladly supplied Baldwin not only with provisions, but also with detailed intelligence about Dukak's troop movements and intentions. As the coastal road from Tripoli approaches Beirut, it passes through the narrow gorge of the Nahr el-Kelb, or Dog River, a place renowned since ancient times. Conquerors from as far back as Pharaoh Ramesses had left inscriptions there to mark their victories. It was here that the Damascene forces lay in wait for Baldwin. Warned by the emir of Tripoli, Baldwin approached the pass with great caution. He soon found himself facing the full army of Dukak, reinforced by troops from the emir of Homs. Off the coast, an Arab naval squadron from Beirut positioned itself to cut off his retreat. Baldwin's attempt to force the crossing failed against such overwhelming numbers, and he was relieved when nightfall allowed him to withdraw. The emir of Homs urged an immediate night assault, but Dukak's commanders chose to wait until daylight, when they hoped the fleet could coordinate with them. Throughout the night, the Muslims harassed the Franks with volleys of arrows. Fulcher, Baldwin's chaplain, later wrote, "How I wished I were back home in Chartres or Orleans." And he wasn't alone in that feeling. But Baldwin didn't lose heart. At dawn, he staged a retreat, placing his best-armed troops at the rear. The Damascenes eagerly gave chase. Then, at a narrow bend in the road, just beyond Juni, about 5 miles north of the pass, Baldwin suddenly turned and unleashed his full force on the unsuspecting pursuers. The sudden attack threw the enemy into confusion, forcing the front lines to stumble back into the mass of troops behind them. Chaos broke out on the narrow path. Baldwin pressed the advantage. The Arab ships were unable to get close enough to shore to provide any meaningful support, and panic spread through the Muslim ranks. By nightfall, the entire enemy force had either retreated into the mountains or fled behind the walls of Beirut. Baldwin and his men camped that night at Juni. The next morning, carrying off their spoils, they crossed the Dog River unopposed. From that point onward, Baldwin's journey continued without interference from Muslim forces. He passed safely by Beirut and Sidon, and at Tyre, the Egyptian governor even provided him with supplies. On the final day of October, he arrived at the Christian-held port of Haifa. Though Haifa was under Tancred's control, Tancred himself was in Jerusalem, helping Daimbert in a futile effort to seize the Tower of David from the Lorrainers before Baldwin could arrive. In Tancred's absence, the Frankish garrison at Haifa offered to open the gates to Baldwin. However, he was wary of their intentions and chose instead to camp outside the city. After allowing his men a few days to rest, he resumed his march down the coast toward Jaffa. Upon hearing of Baldwin's approach, Tancred rushed to Jaffa in an attempt to secure the town, but the citizens rejected him and drove him out. Baldwin entered Jaffa to a warm and enthusiastic welcome from the people, but he didn't linger. On November 9th, he turned inland and ascended into the hills toward Jerusalem. As he approached the city, the entire population came out to greet him in a joyous procession. It wasn't just the Franks who welcomed him. Greeks, Syrians, and Armenians also gathered to honor his arrival and escorted him with celebration to the Holy Sepulchre. His rivals had been swept aside. Daimbert withdrew from the Patriarch's palace to a monastery on Mount Shaun, devoting himself to prayer and religious reflection. Tancred retreated to his lands in Galilee. The period of disorder that had plagued Palestine since Godfrey's death had come to an end. On Sunday, November 11th, St. Martin's Day, Baldwin was formally crowned king of Jerusalem, receiving broad approval and rejoicing from the people. Baldwin was too shrewd to act with vengeance. Daimbert's enemies, including the former Patriarch Arnulf, had hoped to see him immediately disgraced, but Baldwin took no steps against him. Instead, he left Daimbert in full possession of his position, while Baldwin led a campaign against Arab forces. During this time, Daimbert came to terms with his defeat and began to accept the new political reality. When Baldwin returned to Jerusalem in mid-December, Daimbert was ready to make peace. His dreams of ruling a theocratic state were over, but he could still retain his title and exert influence over the kingdom. Baldwin, recognizing Daimbert's ties to the powerful Pisan fleet, was happy to forgive him and confirmed him in his office. Tancred, however, proved less cooperative. Baldwin summoned him to Jerusalem to answer for having ignored Godfrey's wishes regarding Haifa. Tancred defied the summons twice before finally agreeing to meet Baldwin near the Auja River between Jaffa and Arsuf. But when the time came, he failed to appear and instead requested a meeting in Haifa. A more convenient resolution soon presented itself. With Bohemond still imprisoned and Baldwin of Luborg now ruling Edessa, the Franks in Antioch were left without a leader. They proposed that Tancred serve as regent in his uncle's place. To Tancred, this was an appealing opportunity. It gave him a broader and more independent domain where he wouldn't be overshadowed by Baldwin. And for Baldwin, it meant an easy and peaceful way to part with a vassal he neither trusted nor liked. The meeting in Haifa finally took place in early March 1101 in a spirit of cordiality. Tancred officially returned his fief of Galilee to Baldwin and departed with his blessing to take up his new position in Antioch. On Christmas Day in the year 1100, in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, Baldwin paid homage to Patriarch Daimbert and was crowned king by him. And so, more than 4 years after the princes of Western Europe had first set out on the Crusade, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was officially established. Among all the great leaders who had taken part, it was Baldwin, the penniless younger son of the Count of Bouillon, who emerged victorious. One by one, his rivals had faded from the scene. Many had returned to Europe: Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, Hugh of Vermandois, and Stephen of Blois. Even his own brother, Eustace of Boulogne, who might have claimed Godfrey's legacy, chose instead to remain with his estates by the English Channel. Of his major competitors in the east, Bohemond was languishing in a Turkish prison, while Raymond remained without land, serving as a dependent of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. But Baldwin had waited patiently, seized his chances wisely, and proved himself the most capable, the most patient, and the most strategic among them all. He had earned his crown, and the years ahead would prove that he was worthy of it. His coronation marked a triumphant and hopeful conclusion to the story of the First Crusade. The events of the First Crusade are recorded almost entirely by sources that were written during or shortly after the time in which they occurred. While footnotes often explore details from minor or secondary works, it's important to critically assess the major primary sources we rely on, especially since they don't always agree with one another. The most significant Greek source is the Alexiad by Anna Komnena, a biography of Emperor Alexius I written by his daughter. Anna completed her work about 40 years after the Crusade, in her later years. Her memory may not always have been precise, especially with regard to chronology, and her perspective was shaped by the political and personal realities of a later time. Anna was deeply devoted to her father and aimed to portray him as consistently wise, moral, and compassionate. As a result, she tended to leave out anything that might reflect poorly on him or his allies. She's also notably biased in her treatment of events that occurred outside the Byzantine Empire. For example, her depiction of Pope Gregory VII is colored by strong personal prejudice. Still, modern historians have sometimes dismissed her too hastily. Anna was a highly intelligent and well-educated woman who approached her historical work with sincerity. She tried to fact-check her material and had intended for a long time to write about her father's life. Much of her research likely came from first-hand access to imperial records while Alexius was still alive, where she draws from trustworthy sources, such as her account of the Crusaders' journey across Anatolia, which appears to be based on the reports of the general Tatius. She generally restrains her bias. Though she omits certain facts, there is no solid evidence that she deliberately fabricated events within the empire or at Constantinople. She enjoyed close access to the central figures of the time and was well informed about the affairs she describes. Once her biases are taken into account, Anna Komnena's testimony remains the most reliable source for events involving Byzantium during the First Crusade. Other Greek writers, such as Zonaras and Glycas, and a short anonymous text known as the Synopsis Sathas, contribute very little to our understanding of the Crusade. No official Byzantine records from the time have survived, except for some letters supposedly written by Alexius to Western rulers and church leaders. These letters only exist in Latin translation, and the translations themselves are not trustworthy. A few additional insights come from the letters of Theophylact, Archbishop of Bulgaria, although these have not yet been fully edited or studied in detail. The Latin sources are more numerous than the Greek ones and provide the majority of our information about the First Crusade. Raymond of Aiguillers, also known as Raymond of Aiguille, from the Haute-Loire region in France, joined the Crusade alongside Adhemer of Le Puy and later became chaplain to Count Raymond of Toulouse. He began writing his chronicle, The History of the Franks Who Took Jerusalem, during the Siege of Antioch and completed it by the end of 1099. His account focuses on Count Raymond's campaign, and although he was a loyal supporter of the southern French contingent, he didn't shy away from criticizing his leader. He expressed disapproval over Raymond's hesitation to move forward from Antioch and was not supportive of the Count's favorable stance toward the Byzantines. In fact, he only refers to the Greeks once without hostility. Raymond's involvement in the episode of the Holy Lance has led some to question his credibility, but within the scope of his account, he appears honest and well-informed. His work quickly gained popularity and widespread circulation, and although some early manuscripts contain later editions, it was never formally revised. Fulcher of Chartres attended the Council of Clermont and later traveled to the east with his lord, Stephen of Blois. In June 1101, he became chaplain to Baldwin of Bouillon and remained in his service thereafter. His chronicle, The Deeds of the Franks Who Journeyed to Jerusalem, was written in 3 parts, in 1101, 1106, and between 1124 and 1127. Fulcher was the best educated of the Latin chroniclers and also the most dependable. Though loyal to Baldwin, he maintained a notably balanced and objective perspective. It's only in the final part of his chronicle that he expresses any hostility toward the Byzantines. Generally, his views on Eastern Christians were fair and respectful. His account served as a key source for many later writers. Bartolf of Nantes, likely writing from Syria, published an edition of the earlier parts of Fulcher's work around 1108, adding mostly geographic details. A summary of the later sections is attributed to Lisiard of Tours. Fulcher's full chronicle became a major source for other historians of the Crusade, including William of Malmesbury, Richard of Poitiers, and Sicard of Cremona, all of whom relied heavily on his narrative. The most widely read account of the Crusade from that time was an anonymous work known as the Gesta Francorum et Aliorum Hierusolyminorum, the deeds of the Franks and the other pilgrims to Jerusalem. It was probably written as a diary by one of Bohemon's followers, who later continued on to Jerusalem under Tancred's command. The chronicle ends with the Battle of Ascalon in 1099 and was first circulated in 1100 or early 1101. We know that Eckhard read it in Jerusalem that same year. However, even the earliest surviving manuscripts already include later editions, such as a literary embellishment of the Siege of Antioch and a reworked account of Bohemon's dealings in Constantinople. That particular passage was likely added around 1105 and was inspired directly by Bohemond. There is also a section lifted from Raymond of Aguilar's work. The author was a simple soldier, honest by his own standards, though somewhat gullible and biased, especially in his admiration for Bohemond. The Gesta became popular largely due to Bohemond himself, who treated it as a defense of his reputation and actively promoted it during his tour of northern France in 1106. Not long afterward, the Gesta was reissued almost verbatim by a priest from Poitou, who had also participated in the Crusade. His version, titled The Journey to Jerusalem, included a few additional personal anecdotes. Around 1130, a monk from Monte Cassino produced a compilation called The History of the Holy War, which was based largely on the Gesta, but also drew material from Radulf of Caen, an unknown lost source, and local legends. The Gesta also inspired several other rewritten versions. Around 1109, Guibert of Nogent created his own version, adding personal reflections, borrowing from Fulcher Chartres, and adopting a more critical and moralistic tone. Around 1110, Baldric of Bourgueil, who later became Archbishop of Dole, revised the Gesta with the goal of improving its literary quality. Then, around 1122, Robert of Rheims published the Historia Hierosolymitana, a more romantic and popular retelling. The Gesta also influenced a number of smaller works, such as the brief, anonymous tract The Expedition Against the Turks, as well as the sections on the Crusades found in the chronicles of Hugh of Fleury and Henry of Huntingdon. Three other notable chroniclers who wrote about the First Crusade had not taken part in it themselves. One of them was Eckhard, abbot of Ora, who traveled to Palestine with the German Crusaders in 1101. After returning to Germany, around 1115, he began writing a book called the Hierosolymita, which was meant to be part of a larger world chronicle he had planned. His account is a mix of his own limited personal experiences and stories told to him or his friend, Fertolf of St. Michaelsburg, by actual crusaders. He also made use of previously published chronicles. Although he often named his sources, Eckhard was rather credulous and didn't always question what he was told. Radulf of Caen arrived in Syria in 1108. Before that, he had served under Bohemond during the campaign in Epirus in 1107 and later became associated with Tancred. After Tancred's death, around 1113, Radulf wrote the Deeds of Tancred, King of Sicily, in the Jerusalem expedition. The work survives in only one manuscript and was never completed. Radulf wrote in a style that reflects more pretension than knowledge. Although he includes a few unique details about Tancred, much of his material comes from earlier published sources. Yet there's no clear evidence that he had read the Gesta Francorum. The most comprehensive contemporary narrative of the First Crusade comes from Albert of Aix, Aachen, whose work The Christian Expedition for the Rescue, Purification, and Restoration of the Church of Jerusalem was written around 1130. Virtually nothing is known about Albert personally, except that he never visited the Holy Land. Until the 19th century, his chronicle was considered the most reliable account of the Crusade, trusted by historians like Gibbon. But after harsh criticism from scholars such as von Sibbel, his reputation suffered more than it probably should have. Albert's work is a patchwork of legends and eyewitness stories, compiled with little sense of critical evaluation and without citing his sources. His portrayal of Peter the Hermit's early life is clearly inaccurate, but the narrative of Peter's expedition likely comes from someone who participated in it. Practical details, like the travel times between different points, appear credible. For the account of Godfrey's journey to Constantinople and the march through Anatolia, Albert almost certainly relied on a first-hand report from a soldier in Godfrey's army. It's likely that Albert had long been recording information from returning crusaders and pilgrims before assembling his book. While the legendary material is fairly easy to spot, his description of the actual events of the Crusade deserves to be taken seriously. Lastly, William of Tyre, considered the greatest historian of the Crusader era, wrote his massive history of deeds done beyond the sea about 70 years after the First Crusade. For the events up to the establishment of the Crusader states in Palestine, William leaned heavily on Albert of Aix's work. However, after the conquest of Jerusalem, he also used records and oral traditions preserved in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. While his chronicle becomes a valuable source only after Baldwin's rise to power, a more thorough analysis of William's contributions is planned for a later volume. Another perspective on the Crusade comes from the Genoese chronicler Caffaro, who authored the Annals of Genoa, covering the years 1100 to 1163, as well as a work titled De Liberation Civitatem Orientis, written in 1155. This latter text was discovered a century later among old papers and may have been slightly edited before being published. Caffaro came from a Genoese family that arrived in Palestine in 1100. Although his writing reflects a strong sense of Genoese pride, it is measured and generally reliable. Chroniclers in Western Europe at the time also recorded events of the First Crusade, but they mostly relied on the main sources already discussed. One exception is the Chronicle of Zimmern, which offers some unique insights about the German Crusaders. The Crusade also inspired a wave of epic poetry in Latin, Old French, langue d'oil, and Occitan, langue d'oc. While these works are more significant for their literary and cultural value than for factual accuracy, a few are worth noting. The Latin poets Geoffrey the Lombard, Joseph of Exeter, and Gunther of Basel provide no real historical value. However, the Provençal chanson de Nioche, traditionally attributed to Gregory Bachata, is more promising and deserves further study. In the Old French tradition, there is another chanson de Nioche by Grainder of Douai, which draws partly from Robert the Monk and partly from an earlier epic composed by Richard the Pilgrim. Richard, who appears to have joined the Crusade with Robert of Flanders' army, was a simple and not especially learned man, but he had his own distinct outlook. For instance, while he regrets that the Crusaders did not capture Constantinople, he speaks favorably of Titius, the Byzantine general. There is also a related poem by Gilon, with additions by someone named Fulcher, based on the same narrative tradition. Another later work, the Spanish Grand Conquista d'Ultramar, draws from Bachata, Grainder, and William of Tyre. Finally, the legendary cycles centered on Godfrey of Lorraine, such as the tale of the Knight of the Swan, Chevalier Osigna, contains only mythical stories and no historical value. Surviving letters from the time of the Crusade are rare, but those that remain are extremely valuable. Among them are a few letters to and from Popes Urban II and Paschal II, 2 appeals from clergy in the East, and 2 official dispatches from the Crusade leaders, which, while interesting, are not entirely free of bias. Most important, however, are letters from 2 leading Crusaders, Stephen of Blois and Anselm, Bishop of Riedmont. Stephen wrote 3 letters to his wife during the campaign. The first, sent from Constantinople, is lost. The second came from the Crusader camp near Nicaea, and the third from Antioch. Though Stephen was seen as a somewhat weak figure, he wrote with honesty and enthusiasm, and his letters offer a rare, deeply personal glimpse into the Crusade experience. Anselm's 2 letters, both written from Antioch and addressed to his superior, Manasses, Archbishop of Reims, are more formal but still provide valuable details about the Crusader campaign, even if they lack Stephen's human touch. In addition to these, a small number of papal decrees regulating the Crusade and charters establishing the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem have survived. These documents are, by nature, extremely important. Likewise, the archives of Genoa and Venice become increasingly significant as these maritime republics began to take a more active interest in Crusader affairs in the East. Although Arabic sources are numerous and highly valuable for studying the later Crusades, they offer limited insight into the First Crusade. No official documents or charters from the time have survived. The large encyclopedias and geographical works that were popular in the Islamic world largely overlook this period, with one exception. The writings of Arab chroniclers who lived during the First Crusade survive only in small fragments, preserved as quotations in later works. As a result, there are only three main sources of real value. Ibn al-Qalanisi, a native of Damascus, wrote a history of his city between 1140 and 1160. His work, titled Mudhale Tariq Dimashq, continuation of the Chronicle of Damascus, was intended as a sequel to the earlier world history of the chronicler Hillel. While Hillel aimed to record global events, Ibn al-Qalanisi focused solely on the affairs of Damascus and its rulers. He spent his life working in the city's chancery, eventually rising to become its chief official. This gave him access to detailed and reliable information. His account is generally accurate and objective, except when discussing the actions of his political patrons. Ibn al-Athir from Mosul wrote his comprehensive Camel at-Tawarik, The Complete History, at the start of the 13th century. Although he wrote over a century after the First Crusade, his careful use of earlier sources, some now lost, make his account one of primary importance, even if his entries on the Crusade itself are typically brief. Kemal ad-Din, also spelled Kamal al-Din, a historian from Aleppo, compiled his unfinished Chronicle of Aleppo and an accompanying encyclopedia about 50 years later. He also relied on earlier sources and had the scholarly habit of citing them by name in his encyclopedic work. Among these lost sources, the most regrettable is the history of the Frankish invasion by Hamdan ibn Abd Yarahim of Maratha. Even by Kemal ad-Din's time, only a few pages of that work had survived. Other lost works include a history written by Ibn Zurayk of Meriden, Yemen, who was born in 1051 and participated in events of the Crusade. Only a few fragments of his chronicle remain. A northern Syrian chronicle by Al-Azimi of Aleppo, born in 1090, survives in a slightly more substantial number of excerpts. These fragmentary and second-hand sources are all that remain of the Muslim accounts of the First Crusade, and though limited, they offer crucial insight into how the early crusading movement was perceived in the Islamic world. There is one major Armenian source that is essential for understanding the period of the First Crusade, the Chronicle of Matthew of Edessa. This work covers the history of Syria from the year 952 to 1136 and was likely written before 1140. Matthew was a somewhat naive writer, known for his strong dislike of the Greeks and his limited sympathy for fellow Armenians who followed the Orthodox Church. Much of what he reports about the Crusade itself appears to have come from an uninformed Frankish soldier. However, when it comes to events in and around his native city of Edessa, Matthew is a highly informed and valuable witness. Later Armenian chroniclers, including Samuel of Ani and Matthew of Erevank, writing in the late 12th century, and Kyriakos of Gantsag and Vartan the Great in the 13th century, only discuss the First Crusade briefly. These authors seem to have drawn primarily from Matthew of Edessa and from a now-lost history by a certain John the Deacon, whom Samuel speaks of with high praise. John is noted for his particularly strong hostility toward Emperor Alexius and his mother, Anna Damascena. The only known Syriac work that addresses the First Crusade is the Chronicle of Michael the Syrian, who served as the Jacobite Patriarch of Antioch from 1166 to 1199. His account, however, offers only a brief and limited treatment of events before 1107. Michael drew on earlier Syriac chronicles that are now lost, as well as some Arabic sources. His chronicle becomes more informative only when he begins recounting events from his own lifetime. Although several of the primary sources on the First Crusade have been edited individually, The most comprehensive collection remains the Recueil des Historiens de Crusades, published in Paris beginning in 1844. This monumental work includes texts in Latin, Old French, Arabic, Greek, and Armenian, along with French translations for the Greek and Eastern texts. Despite its importance, the Recueil is not without flaws. Except for the fifth volume of the Latin texts, which appeared several years after the others, much of the editing is careless. There are many unexplained omissions, and the French translations are not always reliable. Still, despite these shortcomings, the Recueil remains an essential resource for any serious study of the Crusades. Medieval historians, regardless of their origin, were known for wildly exaggerating numbers when estimating armies too large to count accurately. For that reason, it's impossible today to determine the true size of the crusading forces. Some of the most famous chroniclers made bold claims. Fulcher of Chartres and Albert of Aix estimated that 600,000 fighting men joined the First Crusade. Eckhard claimed 300,000. Raymond of Aguillers gave a more conservative figure of 100,000. Anna Comnena wrote that Godfrey of Lorraine alone brought 10,000 knights and 70,000 infantry. Clearly, these figures are symbolic, intended only to suggest a vast multitude. But when it comes to smaller units, the chroniclers' numbers might be more realistic, though still approximations rounded for simplicity. We can still draw some conclusions from their testimony. Non-combatants. The number of non-combatants traveling with the Crusaders was likely very high, though difficult to measure precisely. Many knights brought their wives and sometimes children. Raymond of Toulouse traveled with his wife. Baldwin of Bouillon brought his wife and children. Bohemond had at least one sister with him. Several women are known to have joined Robert of Normandy's expedition. Each noble lady would have had servants and attendants, and there were many more ordinary women, both respectable and not, who followed the army. Male non-combatants were also common, like Peter Bartholomew and his employer, and the clergy were especially numerous. In times of danger, many non-combatant men were likely drafted into auxiliary roles. But when calculating the size of the Crusader host, it's reasonable to assume that permanent non-combatants, women, children, and the elderly, made up no more than 1/4 of the entire group. Mortality. Death rates were especially high among the non-combatants, particularly older men and children. Among the combatants, infantrymen likely died in greater numbers than the more privileged knights and nobles, who could afford better care and food. In battle, however, cavalry were more exposed and therefore may have suffered casualties at a similar or higher rate than the infantry. The ratio of cavalry to infantry in the Crusader armies appears to have been about 1:7, assuming all potential combatants were counted as infantry. Though Anna Comnena likely exaggerated the total numbers in Godfrey of Bouillon's army, the relative proportions she gave are probably accurate. At the Battle of Ascalon, where every available soldier in Palestine was deployed, there were reportedly 1,200 cavalry and 9,000 infantry, a ratio of approximately 1:7. 5. During the siege of Jerusalem, according to Raymond of Aguillers, there were 1,200 to 1,300 knights out of a total force of around 12,000 men, a similar proportion. This number also included Genoese and English engineers and sailors. Here, the word knights refers simply to armed horsemen, not noblemen in the chivalric sense. Many of the infantry were poorly equipped, and archers and pikemen likely made up only a small fraction of the whole force. Of all the Crusader armies, Count Raymond of Toulouse likely commanded the largest. Although exact numbers are scarce, we get a clue from his decision at Coxen, when he mistakenly believed the Turks had abandoned Antioch. He sent a detachment of 500 cavalry, including keen knights, to seize the city. The number 500 appears often in sources and may have been seen as a standard size for large detachments or raiding parties. It's unlikely Raymond would have sent half his mounted troops on such a mission, suggesting his full cavalry force was likely 1,200 or more, with a total army of perhaps 10,000 men, excluding non-combatants like women, children, and the elderly. The Chronicle of Lucca reports that Bohemond brought 500 knights eastward, which aligns with Anna Karenin's remark that his army was not especially large. For his Cilician campaign, Bohemond gave Tancred a force of 100 knights and 200 infantry, later sending another 300 infantrymen as reinforcements. These figures are internally consistent. The only credible indication we have regarding the size of Godfrey's army, aside from Anna's clearly exaggerated estimate, comes from his decision to send 500 cavalry and 2,000 infantry to support his brother Baldwin's campaign in Cilicia. It seems highly unlikely that Godfrey would have given up more than half of his cavalry, even though the detachment was expected to rejoin him before he reached Antioch. One could speculate that Raymond's financial offer at Rugia was based on paying 10 sous per cavalryman. If we also assume Anna's figures should be reduced by a factor of 10, then Godfrey likely had about 1,000 cavalry and 7,000 infantry when he arrived at Constantinople. He must have suffered significant losses by the time of the Rugia meeting, not counting the men who had departed with Baldwin to Edessa. However, his forces had been reinforced by survivors from Peter the Hermit's ill-fated expedition and the failed German Crusades, along with some of Guymer's Marines, who, given that their leader was from Bouillon, would naturally align themselves with Godfrey and his brothers. At Rugia, Robert of Normandy was considered equal in rank and strength to Godfrey. If Godfrey had 1,000 cavalry, then Robert likely had a comparable force. A century later, the Duchy of Normandy was responsible for supplying its duke with just under 600 knights. For the Crusade, Robert may have been able to gather a slightly larger cavalry force, perhaps around 650. He was also joined by additional troops from Brittany and across the English Channel, possibly adding another 100 to 150 horsemen. After Stephen of Blois and Hugh of Vermandois returned to Europe, Robert assumed command of the remnants of their forces. Stephen, though his domain was relatively small, was wealthy and could have contributed 250 to 300 cavalrymen. Hugh probably brought no more than 100. Altogether, Robert may have commanded close to 1,000 cavalry at the time of the Rugia Council. Using the same reasoning, Robert of Flanders likely had around 600 cavalry. Some of these troops may have come from neighboring territories, such as those held by the Count of Hainaut. Though Robert was only officially required to supply the French king with 20 fully armed knights, he later pledged a force of 1,000 cavalry to Henry I of England in a treaty. So raising 600 mounted troops for the Crusade would have been well within his capacity. Bohemond's force of 500 cavalrymen, as recorded in the Chronicle of Lucca, aligns well with the overall estimates. If we include the troops of the minor lords as part of the major armies and assume that the financial offers made by Raymond at Rugia were intended as personal incentives, then the total strength of the Crusader expedition likely amounted to around 4,200 to 4,500 cavalry and approximately 30,000 infantry, which included civilians who could be mobilized if necessary. A letter from Daimbert to the Pope states that the Crusader army consisted of 5,000 cavalry and 15,000 infantry. It's likely that the infantry count referred only to armed fighters, and the number of cavalry is probably a slight exaggeration from a base figure closer to 4,000. These totals may not seem particularly large. Yet when we examine specific battles as described by the chroniclers, the numbers reported are even lower. For example, during the battle at the Lake of Antioch, where reportedly all available knights were deployed, only 700 were present. Many knights at the time were ill, and a letter from Anselm of Riedmont suggests that the real issue was a shortage of horses. He estimated that only around 700 cavalry were fit for service during the siege of Antioch, as many mounts had died from hunger and exposure. He made it clear that there was no lack of men. It's also likely that Raymond kept his cavalry back to defend the camp during this engagement. In the following month, a raid led by Bohemond and Robert of Flanders was said to consist of 2,000 cavalry and 15,000 infantry, excluding Raymond's troops. Later, at the siege of Jerusalem, only about 1,200 to 1,300 cavalry remained, along with just over 10,000 infantry. The numbers were similar during the Battle of Ascalon. Although many soldiers had died, been killed, or returned home, it's difficult to believe that the army's strength could have dropped by 2/3 between the Ruggia Conference and the Jerusalem campaign. Therefore, all such figures must be treated cautiously. It seems reasonable to conclude that the Crusader army, upon departing from Constantinople, reached the totals previously estimated. Over the following 2 years, however, it suffered significant attrition. By the time of the Ruggia meeting, Raymond was likely relying on outdated and overly hopeful estimates when making his offers. The more modest figures given in accounts of Baldwin's campaigns appear to be more realistic and trustworthy. Estimating the size of Peter the Hermit's original force is just as difficult. The figure of 40,000 given by one chronicler is clearly an overstatement, though it's plausible that as many as 20,000 people followed him. The majority of these, however, were non-combatants. For comparison, it's worth noting that the entire Byzantine army during the 9th century is believed to have numbered around 120,000 soldiers. However, by the end of the 11th century, the empire's loss of its Anatolian territories had significantly reduced its military capacity. By that time, Emperor Alexius likely had about 70,000 troops at his disposal, though most of them were required to defend the empire's widely scattered frontiers. A substantial portion of the army was likely disbanded each winter to cut costs. It's unlikely that any Byzantine field army during this later period exceeded 20,000 soldiers, though those who were deployed were generally well-trained and well-equipped. Estimating the size of Muslim forces during this time is far more difficult. While Kerboga's army is believed to have numbered around 30,000, there is no solid evidence to confirm this. His troops were, however, capable of enforcing a more effective siege on Antioch than the Crusaders had managed. The Egyptian force at Ascalon was clearly larger than the Crusader army, but its actual numbers are unknown. As for the Turkish army at Dorylaeum, it was probably smaller than the Crusader force. The Turks typically relied on swift attacks and high mobility to offset their numerical disadvantage.